I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm kind of coming to you from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to extend that respect to anyone who's joining us from other lands, to their elders, and to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us here today. Okay. So, welcome to the June edition of our seminar series. I'm Ben Spivak. I'm Senior Lecturer here at the Centre for Forensic Behavioural Science. And every month, as part of our seminar series, we invite an expert to give a talk on a topic of their interest, in particular kind of research that they're currently working on. And today we're lucky enough to be joined by Dr. Muriel Tarbin, who I'll introduce in a moment. Before I do, you may have heard about this talk through our mailing list, or you may have been referred to the talk through someone else, or may have passed you a link. You may have discovered it some other way through social media. But if you do want to be kind of made aware of this seminar series, seminars that we have coming up, please send an email to the email you see on your screen. Nod your head, guys, if you can see the email. Fantastic. Okay. And then you'll never miss out on a seminar again. Okay. So we've got some fantastic ones lined up later this month. We have Dr. Carleen Thompson, who will be talking about risk assessment for domestic violence homicides. Very interesting talk. But that's not what we're here for today. Today we have Dr. Muriel Tarbin. Now, let me introduce Dr. Tarbin. Okay. So Muriel has joined us for the past 2 months here at the Centre for Forensic Behavioural Science, but she's a senior research and teaching assistant at the University of Zurich in Switzerland. She holds a PhD in special needs education from the University of Freiburg, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Her research focuses on interpersonal violence involving people with intellectual and/or developmental disabilities, with a particular interest in the underlying mechanism and risk factors for victimisation and challenging behaviour. Overall, she's interested in how interpersonal violence and challenging behaviour manifest and are responded to across different contexts, including social settings and among adolescents with and without special educational needs. Okay, I think she's with us for a couple of days longer, and today she'll be presenting on a study that she's been working on while she's here, the preliminary findings, I should add, of the study. So we're very lucky to be hearing from Dr. Tarbin as part of this seminar series. Now, I know you're waiting with anticipation for Dr. Tarbin and for me to get off the line, but before I do get off the line, just a quick bit of housekeeping. Okay, so the session will be recorded and we'll see if it's made available on YouTube. Okay, that's not a certainty at this point. If you want to ask questions, there's going to be a Q&A following Dr. Tarbin's talk, okay, where you can, put your most pressing questions to Dr. Tarbin and she will answer them. You can enter your questions in the Q&A section of Teams or simply enter them into chat, okay? And then following the presentation, I'll put those questions to Dr. Tarbin to answer. Okay, I'll get off now. So without further ado, Dr. Tarbin, would you please share your slides and unmute yourself? Thank you very much. Please welcome Dr. Tarbin.
Thank you. Thank you a lot for this introduction. Do you see my slide in the right mode? Yeah, perfect. Then everything is working. Yeah, so I will be presenting you the first findings I have on antisocial behavior of adolescents in Swiss classroom. And I was really much looking forward to this talk. You will see it's really preliminary findings. So I'm not quite sure yet of if I framed it correctly, if my analysis makes sense. So I hope you will be able to follow me through those slides and that we will all learn from each other today. So first thing first, what I am talking about will be this concept of antisocial behavior during adolescence. And it's quite a broad broad concept that refers to several types of actions that all violate social norms and or the rights of others. You will see that here in this talk, I will be focusing on a very mild form of antisocial behavior. So those minor acts and not those more serious transgressions. There are several well-identified risk factors, for example, male gender, but also coming from disadvantaged communities. When we look at antisocial behavior at schools, it's an important aspect of schools because it predicts poorer academic and social outcomes. And even those low to moderate antisocial behavior disrupt learning and classroom relationship. And this is also be seen as particularly challenging for teachers, contributes to teacher stress, burnout, and reduced teaching quality. Now about inclusive classrooms. So how does it look like in Switzerland? Inclusive education is a guiding principle in Swiss schools. It's not that old. It's about 10 years ago that they started to have this policy about inclusive education. Compared to the rest of Europe, we are doing average slight. We are more toward the more separative countries, as opposed, for example, to France or Italy. And so at the primary level, we have most students that are educated in regular classroom. And at the lower secondary level, where we have the adolescents, there are still most students in those mainstream classroom, but we can see that there is more students in the separate settings. So overall, inclusive classroom often includes students with diverse behavioral and learning profile in Switzerland nowadays. And these settings shape how classroom disruption are experienced, perceived, and addressed by teachers and peers. And what I put as a picture on the right side is a picture of the news from last year, because what we see in Switzerland is a really pushback against inclusion and school inclusion. So there are several policies that are trying to be put in place to be much more or much less inclusive. And that's for that particularly targets those special education needs students. So there is in Switzerland a growing resistance toward inclusive education, partly driven by these ideas that students with them they have a disruptive behavior, they behave badly, and that leads to lower achievement for all learners. So that's more about a little bit of the political context in Switzerland. And also the relevance of studying antisocial behavior in our classrooms. What has been very well documented in research is the role of label in teacher assessment of behavior. So special education needs refer to this broad category that includes all forms of disabilities, and also those neurodevelopmental disabilities like ADHD, but also behavioral difficulties. And the last meta-analysis on this subject showed that teacher perception are influenced by those labels. They were able to show a moderate negative label effect that was robust across different types of evaluation, so whether academic outcome, but also behavioral assessment, different samples, different countries too, different diagnosis categories, so ADHD, intellectual disabilities, autism, and it was also independent of the evaluator expertise, so whether they had a background in special needs education or not, or the child gender. What I find interesting is that those expectations, they shape not only the academic judgment, but also the behavioral evaluation. And even when the behavior is controlled for, there is this label effect where students with SEN are often perceived more negatively. So this again shows the relevance of looking at this antisocial behavior because it's perceived differently depending on the status. And when we look a little bit more on those classroom disturbance, you will see that I will focus here on this deviant student behavior. And in our study, we also had two scales, so undisciplined behavior and antisocial behavior. Here, you can see that it's translated by disocial behavior. And that's maybe also one of the main points we will be able to discuss today. My German-speaking colleague, they rather translate the word we are using as disocial behavior in English, but from French, I translate it into this antisocial behavior. So I'm curious to hear what English-speaking people do say about those two words. Well, anyway, what can see is also that those deviant student behavior, they belong within a classroom, and that this disruption or arise through the interaction and are shaped both by what actually happens, but also by the perception of teacher and students. So it's interesting to look at, to have those multi-informant approaches, because student, teacher, and external observer often disagree in their rating of student behavior. And what we know from previous research studies is that teachers report more undisciplined behavior than their student, which is also, I think, something quite common in self-report, when one tends to say that one behaves better than what one actually do. And previous studies have found quite strong rater effect, with 30 to 50% of the variance explained from teacher and student. So as we see, the perception of those school-related problem behavior is influenced by many factors beyond the behavior itself. And that's what I wanted also to have a closer look in our study. So it's not only a function of the actual student conduct, but it also reflects the lens of the rater and the social environment, so the classroom in which this behavior unfolds. So what I will be focusing on today are like three research questions to look at this different informant perspective and the contextual sensitivity in assessing antisocial behavior. So the first is how the perception of students' antisocial behavior differ across informant, those self-report, homeroom teacher, and mathematics teacher. If or to what extent the mathematics teacher evaluate antisocial behavior different for students with and without special education needs. And finally, to have a look at the perception in relation to the classroom overall climate. To do that, I am using the data from the Sinus project, and here you see the research team that conducted this project with me. So there are two PhD students and one other postdoc under the direction of the Prof. Elisabeth Moser-Pitt. And the whole study was conducted in the German-speaking part of Switzerland, so the biggest part of Switzerland, closer to Germany and Austria. Don't be confused by the fact that I have a French accent. It's because I come from the part that is closer to France. Maybe also a little bit of context. So Switzerland is a very small country, and we have 26 states and 4 different languages. And here we focused on only this Swiss-German part of Switzerland. The goal of the overall project was really to have a deeper look on the support and special education needs service that we have in secondary school, because Switzerland is so it's such a federal state that we don't really know what the other 25 parts are doing. So the point was to look at how they are doing and how are those supports organized. And we are also looking at different factors, how they influence students' learning progress in mathematics and their social integration. So I will be focusing, that's an overview of all the data that we have, and I will be focusing only on these, the data that we collected in November last year, that are based on this overall disruptive classroom behavior from the student perspective and from the teacher perspective. We have 27 schools that participated in our study, and that's 88 mathematics class. It's 1,059 students, and among them, we had 28% of the sample that had a special education needs. In Switzerland, and that's maybe also a difference with Australia, I'm not sure how it works, but for example, in Switzerland, there is no need to have a formal diagnosis to get this special education needs label. So 116 had a formal diagnosis, and the other had this special education needs support. And overall, 115 teachers participated in the study, and because our focus in this study was mathematics achievement, mathematics class, we also have more mathematics teacher. So here you see the scale that we use to assess antisocial behavior. That's built from scale that was used in another study conducted in Switzerland from Eckstein, but it was conducted at the primary level. And you can see that we assess quite, let's say, mild level of antisocial behavior. For example, I laugh at others, I talked meanly at others. And the student had to rate that from never to more than 5 times. Here it's the self-report version, but the teacher had the same version, and then just to fill out, for example, during the last 2 weeks, during the mathematics lesson, Alexander laughed at other so many times, and so on. So they had to do that for all the kids they had in their class. So let's see first about how do perceptions of students' antisocial behavior differ across informants, so those self-report, homeroom teacher, and mathematics teacher. To assess that or to look at that, I did a CFR with multi-group measurement invariance, and I have those 3 informants with this instrument, and I looked at, or I used the global score. So the global score is the mean of the 6 items per informant. I used effect coding to have not a group but as a reference, and I did it sequentially, so configural, metric, and scalar. I will first present just some descriptive results, and then we will go into the measurement invariance result. So first, the descriptive results. Here you can see that we have much more missing for the homeroom teacher. That's expected because we had this focus on math teacher, and we only assessed a few of the homeroom teacher to also give their assessment of antisocial behavior. So that's just to say that those measurement invariance analysis, they are conducted in a smaller sample, not the 1,000 and more students. Then what can see is that the mean is quite low overall, but it's higher for the self-report than in the other teacher. And another fact is that the data are highly skewed. Here you can see it in a more clear way, maybe. It's also, again, just the descriptive overview of those self-report, math teacher, and homeroom teacher. What here one can see is that well, they most never show any type of antisocial behavior. And that for the math teacher, for example, about 800 students that just never display that kind of behavior. That's something that we will come back on later. Then regarding the measurement invariance across the different informants, what can see is that the metric model is not such a good fit, but then if one free the self-rating, then the partial metric model works better. And the scalar invariance fails, so model fit drops sharply when the intercept are constrained. And here I think, or at least for me, it was helpful to look at the standardized factor loading per informant. And here one can see that those self-ratings show the weaker link to the antisocial trait. And when we relax that constraint for the self in the partial metric model, then the partial metric invariance is supported. And here we can also see what we already noticed in the descriptive result is that the self-rating intercept is substantially higher and significantly different than the math teacher and the homeroom teacher. So there is a systematic difference in the response tendency in those self-report. So based on those findings, I also looked then at the measurement invariance across the three different informants at the item level. And here I won't go into too much detail, but it supports what we see in the global mean, which is that students' self-rating were less consistently structured across all items than the teacher ratings. So if we sum up the configurable invariance held, so all three groups have understood the antisocial behavior as a reflecting common underlying construct. And we have this difference with the self-rating. So if we free the self-loading, then the model fits well. But the scalar invariance failed, so students systematically report higher level of antisocial behavior. One can say that then they share a common understanding of the antisocial behavior construct, but we can see that the self-rating are less structured and they show higher average social score. Now I will move on to the second question, which was about those students with and without special education needs. And here I will focus only on the mathematics teacher rating. So here I excluded the one item, the talked mainly about other, because it had a poor factor loading and it was also overlapping with those other items, so it made sense to exclude it. And like that, I had good model fit and a strong internal consistency, or a model fit that was acceptable. I used the cluster argument in Lavande to run the multiple group CFA, and I divided the group into those students with special education needs, so about 300, and those without special education needs. And here what can see is that, well, measurement invariance is supported. So the configurable metric and scalar invariance are supported. And I still looked at the latent mean comparison. It's not significantly higher for students with special education needs, but almost or close. And I still looked at how it looks like for the items, because I was curious. And what I found interesting is that the item level means by special education needs status are higher for the group with special education needs, especially for this item of insulted other and laugh at others. So what can say is that regarding this special education needs status, well, measurement invariance is supported. So teacher applied a shared conceptual structure to antisocial behavior, similarly for those two groups of students. Still, there were rated slightly higher, but that was not significant. And it's also a pattern that one can see at the item level. And now I will be moving on to this classroom antisocial climate, so how it shaped mathematics teacher perception of student antisocial behavior. What I did for that is that I split the group into a low group and a high group based on the median of the classroom level mean antisocial behavior scores. So I had 44 classrooms in each group, one in the high group and the other in the low group. But I had several problems. So at first I tried with an initial CFA with all the 5 items, but then one item had 0 variance in the low group. So I excluded them. And then another item had also near 0 factor loading in the low group. So I also excluded this one. Then I run on the CFA only for those 3 items, laugh at other, insulted other, and took thing away. And I also looked at the intra-class correlation coefficient to look, and this allows me to estimate the source of variance, so the between classroom variance and the within classroom variance. Here, what can see is that, again, configural invariance, metric invariance, and scalar invariance is supported, but the intra-class correlation coefficient is quite high with 0.43. So 43% of the variance in antisocial behavior ratings is explained by the classroom level. But measurement invariance is supported. So even though the scale function equivalently, classroom context explains a large portion of the variance. That suggests that perception of antisocial behavior are shaped not only by individual traits, but also by the broader classroom climate. So overall, if I sum up those 3 research questions, I had the rater perspective, I was wondering about those student characteristics, and I had the context question about the classroom. So the students report more antisocial behavior than teacher, but their response show lower structural consistency. Regarding students' characteristic, one can see that the teacher applied the same rating structure across students with and without SEN. And the classroom context, it's perceived through a shared conceptual lens across classroom, but there is a high between classroom variance that suggests that classroom norms shape visibility and interpretation. And now in the discussion, I don't have a conclusion, but I will draw on 3 findings that I found surprising or that I was not expecting regarding this analysis or this data set. So first, or the first surprise, something that I found interesting is that the self-report are higher than the teacher ratings. And that's quite, or that was not something I was expecting, especially because in other studies, they actually all report more antisocial behavior from the perspective of the teacher. So that's an interesting point, I think. And overall, we can see that there are very low absolute level of antisocial behavior. That's something that I found in other studies too. The fact that the self-report have a low factor loading and scalar non-invariance suggests that they do not interpret this behavior as stable trait. So maybe they rate more like episodic or situational experience. That could be one point. And also I was wondering to what extent there is the fact that those self-report are based on thousands of rating, and the teacher did much more rating than the self-report. So maybe it reflects rater consistency and not better measurement. I think overall the fact that they differ support this context framework of the validity, or the fact that it's interesting to have those different informants, and that they all capture distinct but valid perspective on what is really antisocial behavior. And I was thinking that one of the what would have been interesting to do regarding that would be to use, for example, experience sampling method, and to really have the student and the teacher reporting for the last 5 minutes what they did, rather than the past 2 weeks, to better capture this situational nature. And maybe also, and that's something that I will come back to, is that it points maybe more to peer conflict or to subtle social dynamic that the teacher don't see from their perspective. Another finding I found surprising, or what was not especially expected, is that the teacher applied a shared conceptual structure for the assessment or for evaluating antisocial behavior across students with and without SEN. So it does not really support the labeling effect theory that the measurement will be distorted. And that's quite contrary to previous research studies and the meta-analysis that they suggest a strong expectation-driven silence in those teacher rating. But still, our students with SEN were rated slightly higher on antisocial behavior. So I guess that's possibly to be something that we can connect back to the floor effect and the fact that we have so low overall antisocial behavior. So those subtle differences may go unnoticed or unreported. Or maybe it's just a positive finding that we can acknowledge and say that they base rating on actual behavior and not expectation. And I think that's also a point that is interesting in the meta-analysis on those labeling effect. They see that over the years, the labeling effect was smaller and smaller. And they were wondering if it's also related to an overestimation of the label effect due to those publication bias. So the study that showed no labeling effect are not published. And finally, what I find interesting and surprising is that we have really over 70% of our students, no matter which perspective we look at, that were rated as just never engaging in any antisocial behavior, even though our item are phrased quite mildly. You would expect that a 13-year-old teenager, or we were expecting that they would engage more in such behavior, like talked meanly about others. But that's just not what happened. It's also interesting to see that this variance, the 43% of the variance in math teacher rating is explained by the classroom membership. And I think that suggests that it's shaped by a shared classroom norm and peer dynamics. And that's an interesting takeaway, I guess. But overall, I was wondering if the fact that we found overall those 70% of students that were rated as never engaging, it's maybe also to bring back to this selectivity bias, because the students and teachers that took part in our study were those that had time and wanted to take part in a research study. So it's all going well, maybe. Or maybe it's also that the scale we have do not really capture what we meant, and maybe those behavior more happen online. Or maybe it's also just a positive finding that we can acknowledge, and they are just being all nice to each other. So you see, it's more, I have more question than conclusion, and I don't have prepared a conclusion about that, because I'm looking forward to have your feedback and your thought about all of that. So thank you a lot for your attention, and I'm looking forward to discussing it with you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Muriel. That was a fantastic presentation. A lot to take in. We can now open up for questions and answers. And in fact, we have our first question, but as I ask it, you can type in your own questions. We've got time. Okay, so Troy McEwen asks, could you do any sub-analyses separating classrooms where there is more antisocial behaviour from those where there is less? So analysis at the classroom level to help you look at whether the milieu of the classroom has an effect on both self-reported behaviour and perceptions of special education needs students.
Yeah, I think I haven't done, what I have done is, maybe I can share the slide. I have done something that goes in that direction. Yeah. Let me share my screen again. So you see my screen, right? So what I looked just at the descriptive, and I haven't done much. It's what we find is that there are slightly more boys in those high antisocial classroom, and they were slightly older, and also slightly more special education needs, and also lower social economic status. So that's what I found, but it's really yeah, just the first descriptive analysis I run.
Okay, fantastic. I was wondering, I had a question. You ran ICC for the mathematics teachers' perceptions. Did you run it for the students as well?
Regarding which question?
The ICC, the intra-class correlation coefficient.
No, I didn't, and that's something I could do.
I think that would be interesting. I'm guessing that'll kind of tell you a bit about the classroom milieu as well. If you kind of also find kind of quite high ICCs there, 0.43 is pretty high.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I will check.
Yeah. Okay. Did anyone else have any questions? You can stop sharing your screen, by the way, Muriel. We're getting double. All right, wonderful. Okay, well, I think that might be all in terms of questions. That probably reflects the fact that your presentation was so comprehensive, Muriel. So that was fantastic. If no one can hear you guys because I've switched off your audio, but if you can just, put your hands together for Muriel, that would be fantastic. And you can put your thanks in the chat. That was a great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
yeah, we'll see you later. We'll see you at the next seminar.